Hi, I'm Stephen Carson, coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri, in these United States. Um, Last show before the big event next week, which will, excuse me. There we go. Uh, um, the show next week, or the event next week in Nashville, which I hope you're joining us for. There might still be a chance to slip in. Um, is um, going to mean no show next week because I'll be traveling to the event on Thursday next week. All right. So, other things to mention real quick is that we gratefully receive support for the show from very modest, mostly modest donations on Subscribestar. Most folks donate $5 a month, but a few folks do that, and it starts to add up and help me cover some of the costs that I have for the show. And I guess with that, welcome, Ryan.
Hello, how are you doing?
Hi, we are having a lot of time together. Ryan was just through St. Louis, and he'll be back in less than a week to my house so that we can travel together to get to
The big event.
the big event. Yeah.
Okay.
And mentioning that event is not just shilling the event. What we're covering today is very much connected to what I plan to speak on. My topic is on justice, and one of the first things I'm going to need to do in that talk is address this issue of social justice. And I'm sorry to have to do it, but it's just the reality, right, Ryan? So many things have been corrupted. We have to address kind of the corruption and peel that layer off before we can get back to the thing we want to talk about. I think it's just inevitable, because otherwise people in the room are not sure what you're talking about, because all our language is corrupted, and you know what I mean?
Right, exactly. It's kind of like going to a group of economists or politicians or political analysts and talking about liberalism. What you and I would mean by it is certainly not what they would mean by it. It's like talking
Right.
to just the average person on the street about Christianity. What you and I would mean by it is definitely not what they think it means.
Well, right.
It's
That reminds me, Ryan, the thing I was sharing on Twitter of people condemning people for not being Christ-like when they literally act like Jesus acted, right? Because Christ-like it doesn't actually is not a reference usually to what Jesus was actually like, because people don't really know. People don't actually know the Bible very well and stuff. Um, it's a reference to, I don't know, being a really nice guy or something, right?
Right, exactly. It's the cult of being nice, making sure everyone fits in. Don't say the word sin or hell or anything like that. That's not very Christ-like. Don't charge money changers out of the temple. That's not very
Right, right.
welcoming. So
Yeah, yeah.
you have to be Christ-like. You don't have to act
Right.
as Christ did. You just act like him.
Right, right. Christ-like is being affirming, right, and things
Right?
like that.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I
Just
got
to pick a random word out of the air.
it's funny that you bring that up because probably before the catechism stuff kicked off this year, I was getting into a spat with a few people over this exact word. Because I said that Christ-like is just an inchoate cudgel that they'll hit you over the head with that means nothing. It can change meaning based on whatever sentence is being spewed out. And it has no basis in Christianity. You don't come across Christ-like once in any scripture or tradition until, like, I don't know, 2 decades ago.
Right,
So,
yeah, yeah.
like,
It's a new term. Which,
right,
if
yeah.
it's new, suspect it. This is one of our
Exactly.
roles. Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
So,
and actually the religious stuff that's coming up right now is not irrelevant, as we're going to discover. In fact, Ryan, it made me feel reading this chapter by Hayek, of all people, not a super religious guy, or maybe at all religious. Reading this chapter made me feel a lot more passionate about what Ryan has been up to. And I think you'll see why soon, because there's a very striking paragraph in here where Hayek, from his vantage point of watching this progression, that we're living in the results of a progression that Hayek, as you'll see, clearly saw unfolding and called out a long time ago, and he thinks religious folks had a bad role to play in this. And I think Anyway, so much here, and I hope we can get through it. It's a lengthy chapter. I didn't prepare it as well as I usually like to prepare things, but let's bring it up. What this is a chapter from a 3-volume, something that was published as a 3-volume set, Law, Legislation, and Liberty by F.A. Hayek. The volume which concerns us today is volume 2, The Mirage of Social Justice. So it directly addresses this issue of social justice. And tell me if I'm being inaccurate here, Ryan, but I think when I hear everybody saying we ought to be really opposed to the Civil Rights Act and stuff like that, I think we're talking about the same thing. I mean, the Civil Rights Act, as far as I can tell, is, or the things that we don't like about it, I should say, simply is the legislative instantiation of this notion of social justice.
It's one of the particular forms of legislation that came out of this.
Sorry.
Right.
Well, among other things.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, because to my American history mind, social justice does come up in the 30s. It's just not with the Civil Rights Act or anything like that. It's Charles Coughlin and the very economically redistributing conservatives. That was his whole movement was surrounding social justice, which to him was like a bunch of monetary and financial reforms to be more economically populist, if you will. Sort of like a New Deal, but extremely socially conservative for however long that could last.
Right.
The Civil Rights Act is definitely a form of social justice as it's come to be known by us, and probably by the less conservative elements that were also articulating it at the time. And that's exactly what it is. It's the codification into law of basically just full equality with a veneer of justice overlaid, which I'm sure we'll get into why that is not at all justice.
Right. Fingal asks, I shouldn't forget, I can do this now. Is unjustice distinct from injustice? Yeah, I mostly use the title Unjustice for the stream because I just wanted to use something that would catch people's attention. Having said that, hold that thought, because injustice, I think, is very something that has as clear a meaning as justice does once we peel this evil layer of confusion off of it, which we hope to do today. If justice has meaning, and I think it does, then injustice has meaning, right? But social justice, as we'll see, is a negation, okay? It is outside of the sphere of just or unjust. It is in the sphere of dangerous nonsense, as Hayek will demonstrate to us. So in that sense, maybe that's what I was trying to get at by saying unjustice. I was trying to say sort of the negation of what we think of as just and unjust. Okay, anyway, good question. So but let's get into it. I don't know that I was particularly struck by his Hume or Kant quotes. Let me see if I wanted to share those. Okay, actually, the Kant rule is pretty good. Kant quote is pretty good, at least in summarizing what Hayek's trying to get at. Welfare, just meaning charity, I think is what he's saying. What we would think of as voluntary charity, right? Welfare, however, has no principle, neither for him who receives it nor for him who distributes it. One will place it here and another there, because it depends on the material content of the will, which is dependent upon particular facts and therefore incapable of a general rule. So what Kant is saying there is that charity is something that is human, organic, spontaneous. We help someone because we happen to find out that they need help. They're a friend, they're a relative, whatever. And so we help them. And to try to take that spontaneous, random, you might almost say, bit of free will charity and try to systematize it and turn it into some general system, Kant thinks it's just not going to work, right? And so you can see why this speaks to the heart of what Hayek's concerns are with social or distributive justice. Okay. Okay, right. So first of all, social justice has sometimes, it goes under a few names. It's sometimes been called economic justice or distributive justice. Do you know, Ryan, if Father Coughlin would have talked about distributive justice, would he have used that term?
Coughlin, and
Coughlin,
he
sorry.
specifically used the word social justice.
Okay.
I'm sure if one were to listen to his speeches, he might mention distribution and all that, because that's what it was as a probably I don't remember the exact tenets, but knowing that he came from the sort of longest wealth sharing group, it was probably a slightly more voluntary and scaled back version of what we got under the New Deal. So it is distributive in that sense.
Distributive, right? And I wonder if it had a bit of Chesterton and Belloc's distributism in it. Do you know?
Certainly, yes.
I would expect. Yeah. Anyway. Okay, so first of all, tracing the term. It's new, raising our suspicions right away for those of us who have traditionalist instincts, which is to say, how do I put it? C.S. Lewis, he said, novelty in the sense of, a new invention, a new technology, maybe that's fine. But he says novelty in the sense of morals, of our basic fundamental understanding of human nature, of theology. These are things to be extremely leery of, right? We've been burned quite badly, I would say, by novelty in all these areas. So for me, just right there, that highlighted passage raises a red flag for Hayek to point out that the term social justice, at least in the meaning that we're talking about it today, is really quite recent. So he says not much older than 100 years. This book is 1971. Bear that in mind while we go through this. 1971. It's really quite amazing considering how long ago he wrote this. 1971. So let's call it 150 years, right? It's been 50 years since he published this book. So something like a century and a half that we would find uses of the term social justice in this sense. Let's see. Okay, yeah. So here we go. I'm going to read this passage. Statements which explicitly connect social and distributive justice with the treatment by society of the individuals according to their deserts, according to what they deserve, brings out most clearly its difference from plain justice, and at the same time the cause of the vacuity of the concept, the emptiness of the concept. The demand for social justice is addressed not to the individual, but to society. Yet society, in the strict sense in which it must be distinguished from the apparatus of government, is incapable of acting for a specific purpose. And the demand for social justice therefore becomes a demand that the members of society should organize themselves in a manner which makes it possible to assign particular shares of the product of society to different individuals or groups. The primary question then becomes whether there exists a moral duty to submit to a power which can coordinate the efforts of the members of society with the aim of achieving a particular pattern of distribution regarded as just. Okay, sorry, that was too long and too much is packed into it. Going to have to spend a few minutes unpacking. Okay, what is he saying? Hayek is going to distinguish between a social order, spontaneous order, whatever you want to call it, that we have assigned a term to, society, right? Or to talk about the economy, right? Just because we can put a word on it and sort of think of it abstractly as like a thing in some sense, does not mean it is the same as, say, an organization, like a government, a company, a club, right? Where you have officers, you have a hierarchy. In theory, at least, things happen in the organization because they're decided on in a certain manner, and then the order is issued ultimately down the hierarchy that we should do these things because we're trying to achieve these objectives. The economy is not that sort of thing, right? Society is not that sort of thing. So he says, here's the problem, number one, with social justice. The demand is of society. It's of this order that, certain classes should be gets certain economic classes should get certain results, or certain racial groups should have certain things happen for them. He says that just kind of doesn't make any sense, because that's the sort of thing that you ask of an organization. Hey, chess club, we think that mid-tier chess players are not getting challenged enough. You're always putting them up against the lower tier chess players. They're not getting a chance for growth by being challenged by playing higher tier chess players. You need to adjust how you set up your brackets and all that, so that the mid-tier players get some more of a mix between playing against lower tier and upper tier. That kind of statement makes sense, right? You're talking to an organization about something that they can do to adjust, right? When you talk to society or the economy, that just literally makes no sense. It just doesn't function in that sort of way. It's not that kind of thing, right? It's a category error.
Right, exactly. And some people, especially on the right, sometimes make this issue because they will conflate society with just the population. You can organize populations into groups that are meant to do this or that. But once again, as we mentioned here, just definitionally, society is just the order which naturally arises whenever people organize. And this could be where part of the parts of Misesian theory that have been cast off by basically everyone, specifically the methodological individualism thesis. The only people capable of acting are individuals, could come into play here. It's not saying that there is no such thing as collectives or anything like that, just that the only people who act are in the individuals. There's no organization who possesses the ability to act as the organization. The Coca-Cola company does not, prosecute you for all this other stuff. It's people that do it on behalf of the Coca-Cola company, and you can keep going with that down the line. Whenever you start addressing these collectives as if the collective does act, you make a major error, number one, in understanding how things just function at all. If you really wanted to make this point crystal clear, it would be very funny to see someone make a team of just collectives and see if the collectives can do something without relying on those individuals, which would do the acting, see if anything ever gets done. But more importantly, whenever you have these ideologies that come along and try to modify society or these collectives on the basis that they are collectives, every single error that we're going to see in that sort of modification, or in this case, distribution, social justice, and whatever else, is going to stem from the fact that there's a misunderstanding of what or who does the acting, what or who brings about changes in the world.
Right. Okay, so that's this distinction between organizations, in particular, the very important one, the government, and society or the economy, right? So that's a very important distinction. And he says so if the demand for social justice makes any sense at all, it would be that society should change from being society to being a vast organization in which it becomes possible to issue orders so that whatever your favorite victim group is can now get the just share that they deserve, the justice that they deserve. We shall now sort of turn all of society into a big organization where everybody is under orders, right? And that's where this last line is a killer. So he says, is there a moral duty to submit to such a power, which can turn all the members of society into an organization so that we can have a particular pattern of distribution regarded as just, right? So in other words, he says to do what social justice seems to be asking is to sneak in a demand that we completely change the whole structure of society in an extremely radical way, in a way that, from a certain point of view, as we've explained with Mises, is impossible. Or it's impossible to have the outcome that people imagine it could have. Okay, so Right. So I think we explained that. So now this is quite interesting because, again, he's writing in 71 and he's saying that social justice, as far as he can tell, has been completely adopted by them. Everybody believes it. All the good and great, right? And everybody uses the term. And it's very effective politically. Okay. Now, I feel like, Ryan, this, in a way, this feels a little bit dated because I don't know how much we hear the term social justice as much. I remember it more when I was younger, actually, but I don't know that I hear it that much right now in political rhetoric.
It's sort of been supplanted by all the different equity initiatives that we all hear about, so it's not under one umbrella anymore. It's specific initiatives which are taken out, which probably originated with this and the literature. Social justice is probably riddled in the places where you could find DEI and all this other stuff originating. It's just that it's no longer called that, either in the quest for precision or as a ploy to make sure that all this stuff can't just be combated together. You have to focus on one by one. I don't know which one it would be, but that's your two options. But no, I haven't heard as much. I remember it was the big thing when I was in like middle school still. So like that was it got talked about so much, I think, that it just became sort of embarrassing to say out loud from either side. Because if you were, I remember in high school, if you were right-winged and you say social justice, people would joke and get mad at you for being overly political, sort of as like the ultra-conservative, everything is policy wonk. And if you were a lefty and you brought up social justice, people would groan and roll their eyes and stop listening to you just because everyone was tired of it, really. So that was the state of things a few years ago. I have no clue what it's like in the school systems anymore, but I do know that in the social spheres, no one will say this word anymore just because it's been atomized down to its specific initiatives carried out in pursuit of this.
Right. I think as we go through, everyone's going to find that what Hayek is critiquing under the name of social justice sounds like our world, right? I mean, social justice hasn't disappeared. I think what Ryan's suggesting here is correct. It's just diffused and become the air in which we breathe at this point, so that they don't even have to call it social justice. Having said that, I do hear the term social justice occasionally still used. If you have an ear for it, you'll catch it now and again. It's just not as forward as what Hayek's describing here. He says there are today probably no political movements or politicians who do not readily appeal to social justice in support of the particular measures which they advocate. I wouldn't say that that particular term is used in that way anymore. But do they basically mean social justice when they talk about equity or whatever? Well, yeah, I think they do. I think they're actually referring to what Hayek's critiquing here, just under different language, right? He also says the demand for justice has already in great measure transformed the social order. Recall that this is published after the Great Society programs of LBJ, right? Just a little bit after, but after those mid-60 programs are put into place. And of course, not just in the U.S. I mean, I'm thinking of the U.S., but this was happening in other places as well. He notes that the expression social justice described from the beginning the aspirations which were at the heart of socialism.
And this might tie into the history there just very briefly. Every single socialistic mythology, Marxian or not, after the 1790s, will have as its founding mythos the French Revolution, of which all the battle cries were a form of social justice in some kind. Liberty, equality, and brotherhood were all different planks of social justice, if you will, which I'm sure we'll get into here, and we can probably elaborate on that as we substantiate this. But that is it's a very pertinent analysis that the founding mythos of basically all forms of socialism, including the most predominant kinds in the modern day, will harken back to a giant upheaval of a very great society in the name of what could be termed as a form of social justice.
Right, and Hayek makes a really critical, fundamental point about socialism that's worth remembering. He says we think of classical socialism as being defined by the demand for the socialization of the means of production, but the socialization of the means of production was a means. The end, like what was the point of socializing the means of production? The point of it was to bring about a just distribution of wealth. That was the goal, right? Of which, rethinking how production was done was meant to get us to that goal. And then he goes on to say they later discovered that this could be done. You could do a lot of what Marx was talking about, and get less resistance by using taxation and government services financed by taxation. And so they often have given up on calling for socialization of the means of production. I don't hear much about people calling for that anymore. Because the realization of social justice they're just going for that in a different way. The goal has not changed. The means just were adjusted to something that seemed to work better, that they were able to put into effect better. Okay, so this is the one I really wanted to highlight for those of us who are Christians. I think this is a challenging passage. I'll explain why in a moment. Let me just read. So the phrase social justice could exercise this dramatic effect on society because it has gradually been taken over from the socialists, not only by all the other political movements, but also by most teachers and preachers of morality. It seems in particular to have been embraced by a large section of the clergy of all Christian denominations, who, while increasingly losing their faith in a supernatural revelation, meaning we would call becoming theologically liberal, appear to have sought a refuge and consolation in a new social religion, which substitutes a temporal for a celestial promise of justice, and who hope that they can thus continue their striving to do good. So this is really interesting, right? Because Hayek's not exactly a Bible thumper, but he can't help but notice what was quite obvious by then. I remember talking to Reverend Edmund Opitz of Fee near the end of his life, and he talked about the same thing, which is that, as we all know, theologically liberal people have tended to be politically left-wing, right? And Hayek even is suggesting a reason for that, which is that having lost that supernatural and eternal view, they substitute for it a new religion, a religion which is imminent, which will bring the kingdom of God to earth right now through the state, right? I mean, that's essentially the new religion, right? That has wormed its way into so much of Christianity.
I don't mean to cross-shill our platforms here, but
Please.
I had a very similar idea in mind when I wrote the State and Free Churches article for the Old Glory Club.
Yes.
Just because it's basically, as Hayek writes here, which is a very great summary of what I belabored for that entire article, this is all Christian denominations have this problem. Every single one is facing a varying proportions of its population. A part of it, which is drifting towards a very materialist, very left-wing reinterpretation of Christianity that takes out any form of providence, any form of fearing God, any form of eternal salvation or judgment or anything else, and substitutes it for various worldly ideas, including a lot of what we see and might term the state religion now. A lot of rainbow pride flags and all this other stuff will get flown outside of Christian churches, nominally Christian churches, not because that's Christian necessarily, but because that's what they believe. They've completely thrown out, as Hayek says, supernatural revelation, and they have replaced it with all these forms of justice, like being against purity culture, being for homosexual pride and sodomy and all this other stuff, defending pedophiles and whatever else is the next step. It's the natural consequence. This is the state religion, if you will. If you go back 20 years, it might look slightly different. You might not see as many rainbow flags. You might see a bunch of Israeli flags and a lot of support for foreign wars that are just so happens that all of these organizations support the same thing at the same time, and dropped all mention of providence, fear in God, and all this other stuff, which is pesky fundamentalist Christianity and not the current popular thing. So I was shocked when I read this in preparation for the stream because this whole this whole paragraph right here is. I didn't read this before I wrote my article for the OGC, so this is just observable fact to anyone, it seems, because Hayek and I were not born in the same part of the world. We do not have the same religion. We do not have the same education or upbringing. We don't have the same heritage. It's quite fascinating. We're not even in the same time frame, and these things are still absolutely true. He just takes a paragraph to write what I took like 1,000 words, so...
Well, you're basically both Germanic, But anyway, the last part of this paragraph, he names names. He says the Roman Catholic Church especially has made the aim of social justice, in those words, part of its official doctrine. But the ministers of most Christian denominations appear to vie with each other with such offers of more mundane aims, which also seem to provide the chief foundation for renewed ecumenical efforts. I wanted to slow down a little bit on that Catholic point. Let's see if I can get the darn footnote to pop up. There we go. He refers specifically to Quadragesimo Anno. The encyclical is Quadragesimo Anno from 1931 and Divino Redemptoris from 1937. And I just would like to note that to say that social justice is part of its official doctrine is, I would say, could be taken the wrong way if you don't understand how the Catholic Church works. For a pope to put something in an encyclical does not mean that all Catholics are now required to consider it part of what's called the magisterium. I went over this, Ryan, with our Catholic conciliary to make sure I didn't screw anything up. It's not part of the magisterium. That is the deposit of faith. And that is something that can only be spoken about authoritatively in very, very rare and very precise circumstances. And this is the ex cathedra stuff. It's almost never done. And just because you heard, hey, I heard Pope Francis said such and such, now all Catholics have to believe that. That's not true. There's been many popes. They've said many things. The Eastern Orthodox think the Catholics have been a little too changeable, but they haven't been that changeable. Not about the core parts of the faith,
So that is very true. But to go on the other side of that, it does elevate whatever that thing is written to a much higher standard than if it was not written about at all, which brings to the where this part could potentially be updated. Because it's no longer news, really, that Rome has included that. Rather, it's news that every other place has included that in some core of similar doctrine. So the big catechism controversy that happened when the LCMS published their catechism.
Lutheran Church Missouri Synod.
Yes, right.
But meant to be not the most, but one of the more conservative parts of the American Lutheran Church.
The largest so-called conservative group. They specifically had multiple essays with social justice in the title of their appended to their new version of their catechism.
Of course.
Literally,
it's what Martin Luther would have wanted, don't you think, Brian?
yeah, definitely. I would love to show Martin Luther the status of his of the clergy bearing his name in the modern day. I would love that reaction. But the Methodists quite famously have had their big split over forms of social justice, specifically homosexuals. The Church of England's going through that right now as well. They aren't nearly as explicit as the Lutherans were, but I am absolutely certain that you could probably find the two words social justice in some of the documents leading up to both of these giant splits and controversies. This is all to say, it's no longer news that Rome has it in one of their encyclicals. Rather, it is news that every single major denomination has it basically on equal footing in each of them. It's not die-hard doctrine, if you do not believe in this, you're damned to hell, but rather it's basically being pushed with as much authority as they can push anything, really.
Right. Yeah. And so I wanted to say that because I did not want any Catholic's conscience to be challenged and to feel like, wait, he's telling me to go against the faith. No, that's not right. I do think that the Catholic Church, and as Ryan just pointed out, all Christian churches almost at this point are pushing something that's an error, but most of them I think have not. Most of it could be fixed, right? We could wake up, realize, that social justice thing was nuts. We all read Hayek chapter 9 in Law, Legislation, Liberty. We get it now. We're just going to quietly go back to preaching the gospel like we should have been all along. It could be done, right? They haven't thoroughly compromised the core teachings of the church, but they have been pushing this very much. It has been a current thing in Christianity, I'm sorry to say. So why is this a challenge? Probably, I'm guessing a lot of my audience are saying, well, that's not me. That's not the people I'm in sympathy with. We aren't the ones pushing, this new social religion. We believe in historic Christianity, and we're little o Orthodox and little c Catholic and all that stuff. And as am I. And yet I think it's a challenge for us because Hayek is saying that the influence of the teachers and preachers of morality of the Christian clergy has been detrimental in this area. So it's incumbent upon all of us to do what we've seen Ryan doing, which is to fight back in our Christian churches and fight against this poison, which I think is just heresy. It distracts, it more than distracts from the gospel. It undermines the biblical truth. And as we were all seeing, right? And we need to figure out what it is, and maybe Hayek's helping us here, figure out exactly what it is, put our finger on it, and nuke it from orbit, right? So that, I think, is the challenge. Okay, continuing on from the church, he cites Andrei Sakharov from the Soviet Union. Remember, this is 71. Soviet Union was still around back when I was born. And he says, Sakharov said, millions of men in Russia are the victims of a terror that, quote, attempts to conceal itself behind the slogan of social justice. So the social justice thing has already been wreaking havoc for a long time. But of course, our press is not going to tell us, yeah, they were putting people in the gulag in the name of social justice, because they're pushing social justice. So of course, they're not going to tell us that, right? Thanks to Hayek, this little bit of history has been remembered. Go ahead.
And, so Sakharov, if I remember correctly, I think he was the physicist that was put in the gulags.
Sounds right. Yeah, I think so.
I kind of looked over this when I was scanning before it, but having heard you read it out word for word, that's a very interesting thing, because there was a whole line of academics that were put in the gulags, obviously. That's not really news for anyone that should be listening to this, really. Every single one of them, or I shouldn't say every single one of them, quite a few of them, of these academics that were put in the gulags upon being released or upon finding their memoirs or whatever else, have been accused of basically being fascistic in the post-Soviet world, just because they would argue against things like social justice and whatever else. And not all these people were necessarily interned. There was even more of them that were just persecuted by the state, by the Soviet state rather. And it's very interesting because you'll come across like medievalists and linguists who would come to the conclusion, watching how societies developed in the gulags and contemplating why they were put in there for resisting language reforms and whatever else. They would come to the conclusion that this was basically a spiteful stab at a traditional Russian society, and they were trying to gut everyone that could remember it. Basically, that's where the linguists and those kinds of academics went. The physicists had a very strange time because they weren't really killed off as much as the other groups, because the Soviet Union still needed scientific development. So what would happen?
They needed actual merit.
Right. So what would happen is there would be different parts within gulags or specific gulags themselves where these physicists would be housed, including people like Sakharov, if I remember correctly. And what would happen is they would basically just be laboratories heavily isolated laboratories. And they would develop their thesis as if they were just in a normal university or institute or whatever. And they would be basically sold off to various different party members to publish under their name, so that the union could still develop themselves. They would just plagiarize basically everything. If I remember correctly, I think it might be Sakharov or one of his friends that was working on a bunch of propulsion technology for rockets. That's one group. You had all the different avant-garde types from the art scene that were interned as well. That was another one. They all, basically every single one of these people came to some variation of the conclusion that this socialistic pursuit of equality, of social justice, was basically just trying to spit in the face of reality and hope that it worked. Shaferovich, the mathematician, who started out, if I remember correctly, as an atheist, converted to Eastern Orthodoxy, tried to intertwine mathematics and theology very successfully, if I might add. I don't remember if he was interned necessarily, but he was another one who still to this day gets accused of fascism, just because he was an extreme conservative as a reaction to watching the pursuit of social justice by the Bolshevik Party. It's very interesting to see this name in this essay. Hayek just throws him in here like it's nothing.
Yeah, and it helps us understand that that there's many for whom fascism simply means anti-communist, or maybe even successful opponent of communism, right?
Well, yeah, and I mean, in the modern day, fascism generally just means normal person from 15 years ago. It's not really much of an insult anymore. I've been noticing this. There's been a lot more public people have been accused of fascism, and they kind of just say, who cares? It's
It's losing. They have to move on. That's why they're using white supremacist and whatever else they come up with next. You know?
Exactly.
Galactic human supremacist. Galactic human. Yeah.
Anthropocentrist or something like that.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So Hayek says that scarcely anyone doubts that social justice has a definite meaning, that expression has a definite meaning, describes a high ideal, points to grave defects of the existing social order which urgently call for correction. Even though, again, this is quite interesting information from Hayek, even though until recently one would have vainly sought in the extensive literature for an intelligible definition of the term. By the way, there's something you may not know about Hayek, though I think you might be picking it up as we continue to go through this chapter. He was a great scholar. I would put him up there with the scholars I know, or I would put them up there with him, I guess. Scholars that I have had the pleasure of knowing personally, like Academic Agent, Tom Woods, people who, when they decide to learn about a topic, they don't leave any stone unturned. And when they say the literature is silent on this, you can trust them. And Hayek is one of those people who was able to read and publish in multiple languages. He was a brilliant, brilliant man. He gets criticized sometimes because he was less hardcore than, Mises and Rothbard and stuff like that. Okay, sure. But as you'll see, you cannot fail to learn from Hayek. He was a great historian of intellectual thought. And just a generally great scholar and great thinker, as I think we'll demonstrate. So when he says that, everybody's adopted this term social justice, it's all over the place. Everyone seems to have no doubt that it's meaningful and that it's something we got to address. But, I went digging and I couldn't find that anyone even knows what it means. So that's interesting. So what he says is what we're dealing with social justice is a quasi-religious superstition, but unfortunately a very dangerous one. He says it presents probably the gravest threat to most other values of a free civilization. He already said this before, I'll just say it again. In order to give this phrase meaning, a complete change of the whole character of the social order would have to be effected. And some of the values which used to govern it will have to be sacrificed. Okay, now this might seem obscure here, but what this kept making me think of is when I really understood the problem with intellectual property, so-called intellectual property. And there's a lot of things that can be said against it, but the one I'm thinking of here that's parallel is that intellectual property eats away at traditional property rights. It is not something that you can just add on to traditional property rights. It's corrosive, it's acidic. to traditional property rights, and that's why it's so important for intellectual property to be rejected. Even more important than that is for social justice to be rejected, because it isn't just incompatible with traditional justice. As they try to implement social justice, they destroy traditional notions of justice, and we'll see why that is.
Right, and I was going to ask you just for the audience here. Hayek throws this out, and I think you and I implicitly agree with what he's saying here. But he's saying this is a grave threat to a free civilization or a free society, a society that values liberty. Why would that necessarily be a bad thing, Stephen? For a society to discard freedom and liberty? Aren't those modern concepts that have led us to our current state?
Right. So, at least. It's tricky, right? We tried to cover this piece, and I don't know that we did a great job on Academic Agent's channel, the liberty of the ancients, the liberty of the moderns. But the notion of liberty is actually quite ancient. The notion in which we understand it in the West is a little more modern, but not that modern. We really I trace it back to the Middle Ages, where you had a decentralized order. The Western Roman Empire fell and it was never reconstituted. And so you had a number of different polities, bishoprics and princedoms and kingdoms, and just a patchwork quilt of little polities all over Europe. And what was the result of this? The result was that if the local prince was too tyrannical, people would start leaving. And who would leave? Well, the most productive people, generally, the ones who were most risk-taking, most creative, most productive, they were the ones who'd be out of there first. This exercised an amazing constraint on the local prince because of that decentralization, and this gave us Western liberty. And I think we underestimate just how much of the things that we value are intertwined with Christendom's, what developed in Christendom, in European Christendom. So to lose what Hayek's concerned about here is not just to lose, liberalism or something. I think it is to lose not the only thing, but a part of the soul of what we love about the West. There's other parts to that soul, but this is part of it, I think.
Yes, and that was a very good explanation. The only thing I could possibly add there is that number one, inequality is a good thing, which we've discussed on this channel at length in multiple other videos. All of the great things that you have about life come from the fact that people are different and can do different things better.
Right.
All of your specializations and talents and all the beauty that you can behold in your life is because one person was better than everyone else at making something beautiful. Mm-hmm. And you can only have that inequality with freedom. Every basic pursuit of equality or every limitation of freedom necessarily must curb the other. So every time a organization pursues equality, it will curb freedom. Those people that have better talents, that are better than others at a specific thing, can no longer pursue that specialization. It is a flattening, beauty-destroying thing, just on a more individual level. So in tandem with what you were saying there about Western society and why it is great, even on a personal level, this being against a free society is what's going to destroy beauty. Just because a free society is the only thing that allows people to develop themselves.
Right. This is a great, this is where this feels like he is just speaking right into our current situation. He says people have placed in the hands of governmental powers, for the sake of social justice. People have placed in the hands of government powers which can now not refuse to employ in order to satisfy the claims of the ever-increasing number of special interests who have learned to employ the open sesame of special justice. So when we talk about the latest civil rights thing, LGBTQ, whatever it is next, right? The latest racial ethnic grievance that is clamoring for, to get some kind of privilege or funds channeled towards them. I think Hayek foresaw all of it here in this passage, right? Those special interests have learned to say, "Hey, you're denying my rights, man. This is not social justice. Society should be bent and deformed so that I feel affirmed and validated, and some money gets handed to me, right?" I'm not saying it's all material, by the way. It just that tends to go with it. So, okay, so now he's going to argue that, and I want to pace us because we've been going a while and we're like just beginning here. So let's see. We're on the inapplicability on page 67. He wraps up on 96. So we got about 30 pages. Okay, wow. All right. Let's see what we can do. This is meaty, but I think to some degree he's sort of repeating himself. We'll try to skip around and get to the parts where he brings a fresh point.
Right. If it's like Hayek in any other work, he'll make his best points in the first few paragraphs and then elaborate upon them piecemeal throughout the rest.
Carefully, yeah. I mean, he's always writing this in mind of someone who is really not wanting to accept what he has to say, and he's trying to walk them through it carefully, right? I think for our audience, we can just say, here's a good point. We don't have to argue it in detail, right? Okay, so he says we need to deal with two problems which the demand for social justice raises. First is whether the concept of social justice has any meaning or content, whatever. The second is whether it is possible to preserve a market order while trying to impose social justice on it. He says the answer to each of these questions is a clear no. Hayek can be funny, I think. Let's see. Okay, so right, the more dependent the position of the individuals or groups is seen to become on the actions of government, the more they will insist that the governments aim at some recognizable scheme of distributive justice. So the more government gets involved in deciding who's winners and who's losers and all that stuff, the more people go to the government and say, hey, well, I'm a loser. You guys are like regulating and controlling all kinds of stuff. Regulate it for me this time, right? The more governments try to realize some preconceived pattern of desirable distribution, the more they must subject the position of the different individuals and groups to their control. Hopefully you see what he's saying here. He's saying there's a vicious cycle we're in, right? The government gets involved. That causes individuals to realize that the actions of the government affect them. And so they ask for the government to get more involved, right? That's the circle, the cycle. And he says, where do we head? I'm thinking of Mises' great phrase, middle of the road policy leads to socialism, right? He says, so long as the belief in social justice governs political action, this process must progressively approach nearer and nearer to a totalitarian system. So this vicious cycle is not stable. It leads to more and more government involvement, more and more of commands, as opposed to people living in a free social order, right?
Right, and you'll elaborate more on what justice actually is in your speech at the event, which is why people should go if you are looking for that last-minute purchase. But something that we should probably say here, at least in brevity, is that there is such thing as just laws, perhaps even just regulations on society, but they are not totalitarian. The vast majority of Western history had just legal systems, but what they did not do was pry progressively further into every single facet of your life to make sure that things are being done as just as possible.
Right.
You know, the old, if you rewind a little bit in like a common law society, you would find a lot of focus on restitution and the death penalty for a few very important crimes, very major crimes, rather. If you go look at our modern day, you'll find felony charges for everything that's deemed extra bad socially, and restitution is all but gone in the legal system, except for a few civil penalties, basically. It's you've seen a complete reverse there, and that's just for the legal system. That's not even speaking about the great regime of social engineering to make sure that you don't have a microaggressive life in your workplace or whatever.
Right.
This totalitarian system is not just, no matter how you frame it. Whatever you could see that might be good to emulate here can be done better and has been done better beforehand without having to have a sheriff or an official or a bureaucrat regulate every single action of your life. I feel like that might be good to be said here. This is not Hayek being some lefty liberal who's just against totalitarianism for whatever reason. If you have such a dismal view of him, I invite you to read any other thing he has written. This is it might just be best to be said here. This totalitarian impulse towards social justice is anti-traditional in the most extreme sense. It is managerial, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah, and we can't help but notice how anti-conservative, anti-traditional it's been. He says, okay, so he kind of glides sometimes between market and society, but that's in part because, as he said, social justice can also be seen as a synonym for distributive justice. That is distributing the things that are produced by society, or redistributing is really what it is, from the way that the market would distribute. So he says, here's the problem with this notion of social justice. Our complaints about the outcome of the market as unjust do not really assert that somebody has been unjust. And there is no answer to the question of who has been unjust. Society has simply become the new deity to which we complain and clamor for redress if it does not fulfill the expectations it has created. So he says, in traditional justice, you say, hey, a crime's been done here, an injustice has been done. And somebody says, oh, really? Who did it? Right? I mean, it's like the detective novels. Who done it? Right? Who done it? Well, society did it. What? Could you be a little more specific, right? Well, no. In social justice, that's part of the problem. And let's be clear here. There are things that are done that are wrong. Absolutely. Things done by law, legal means and illegal means that are unjust. But you can point to people who did them, right? In classical justice, you can say he robbed her, right? These legislators passed this bill because they were paid off by the defense lobby, which funneled more money from the rest of us to the war. The makers of instruments of war or whatever, and you can say these particular individuals did it, and if justice could be had, then they'd be in the slammer and we get our money back, right?
Right. You can produce social justice, list of names.
Yeah, you can produce a list of names, maybe a large list, but a list. Whereas social justice is society did it. Just the way things work is not good or something. So that's part of the problem with this. And so, again, social justice can be given a meaning only in a directed or command economy, such as an army, in which the individuals are ordered what to do. And any particular conception of social justice could be realized only in such a centrally directed system. So he's going to make this point over and over again. I'll try not to say it too many times. Organization versus the social order, right? If you want to turn all of society into an organization so that you can try to control the distribution, well, good luck with that. But number one, it won't work. Number two, it'll destroy everything we value. So what is justice? Justice is a system of rules of just individual conduct, right? And he's saying no system of rules of just individual conduct, and therefore no free action of the individuals, could produce results satisfying any principles of distributive justice. You're not going to get traditional justice to give you social justice. To get social justice, you have to get rid of traditional individual justice. Okay? The effects of the processes of a free society on the fates of different individuals are not distributed according to some recognizable principle of justice. The differences in reward, of the market simply cannot meaningfully be described as just or unjust. Why does Bill Gates have a lot of money? Because he's like the most just person? Clearly not. but because he provided a product that was useful to a lot of people.
Or because he, did the best lobbying and had the most inside connections
perhaps.
with an unjust group.
Perhaps, yeah.
He could be rich because he was specifically unjust, and we're under an unjust system.
Right. Okay, yeah. So he keeps saying the same thing over and over again. Let's see. Yeah, so justice requires that the treatment of another person or persons, that is, in the intentional actions affecting the well-being of other persons, certain uniform rules of conduct be observed. And this is where we just have the, going back to the Mosaic Law, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, and so forth. This says, we recognize that you accidentally do someone something happens that accidentally results in someone else being harmed. And we do not consider that an injustice. We consider that, bad luck or whatever, right? What our rules are about is intentional action. You intentionally stole, you intentionally harmed, you intentionally killed, you intentionally defrauded. These are your classic rules of justice. It's individual behavior, intentional individual behavior towards another individual. This traditional notion of justice, I'm going to stop saying traditional notion of justice, just call it justice. Justice has no application to the manner in which the impersonal process of the market allocates command over goods and services to particular people. This can be neither just nor unjust because the results are not intended or foreseen and depend on a multitude of circumstances not known in their totality to anybody. So, aluminum becomes expensive. And so somebody who had came up with this way to have a cheaper substitute for aluminum in certain industrial processes suddenly becomes very wealthy. Is that because that's just, or he deserved it? Well, I don't know. It's the outcome of the market process. That's what it is. And speaking in terms of justice and injustice is simply to misunderstand what the market process is doing, right? Right. So let's see.
It might also be worth noting, since we've just talked about entrepreneurship for 2 streams while I've been on, if you're trying to fix something that's being produced, if you think that an industry is immoral or something like that, you would your most surefire way of exterminating some sort of a malady would be to change the consumer, the people purchasing it, and not the producer necessarily. If you just want to go after the people producing it, the entrepreneurs, you're just going to keep playing whack-a-mole until eventually people stop trying, it gets worse, or you get tired enough to where you stop caring about it, sort of either like prohibition or the war on drugs or something like that. The way that you would actually go about solving this, and this is where social justice gets it wrong, is you would have to change, by whatever means, what people want. So I bet 200 years ago in a much more Christian society, there would be a much less of a demand for various different sorts of drugs that are just taken recreationally today. That's just a form of your consumer base changing, and that would be where you would try to fix a social ill, as advocates of social justice tend to talk about things. It just gets this wrong by category. They think that the evil springs from entrepreneurs producing and selling things, and not from people purchasing it and rewarding the entrepreneur for producing these things. It's a very backwards way of looking at how the market operates, which this is just sort of where the lens goes wrong, and why every single one of their advocates always ends up fighting a forever war against a amorphous social ill like poverty, drugs, housing, or whatever else. It's a complete misunderstanding of how things actually work, whether you like it or not.
Right. And so he says, we consent to retain and agree to enforce uniform rules for a procedure which has greatly improved the chances of all to have their wants satisfied, the market process, right? But at the price of all individuals and groups incurring the risk of unmerited failure. So anyone who advocates for the market says that will tell you most businesses fail, and it's not necessarily because they didn't work hard or whatever, but for all kinds of things, some of which just has to do with kind of things the business owner couldn't have known, or just bad luck, right? They were going along pretty good, and then the Fed decided to raise the interest rate, and then they couldn't get any further loans from the bank, and they had to close the business. Right? It just wasn't even in their control. They couldn't have seen it coming. Well, that's not fair. I'm talking about the Fed, but anyway, point is the market process. We know that it works. Most people have, even socialists, to some degree, have kind of said, yeah, you got to kind of have some market, like Clinton and Blair and people like this. The modern leftists have kind of given in that you've got to have some kind of market process. You got to have some prices. You got to have some trade, so on and so forth. They just think they can kind of do a balancing act. But what this means is that some people are going to fail, and it's not going to seem fair, right? And he says that's something you have to live with. If you try to fix it with social justice, you just destroy the goose that's laying the golden egg, right? Okay, so let's see what else to highlight. He compares the market process to a game, and he says, as in a game, we are right insisting that it be fair and that nobody cheat, but it would be nonsensical to demand that the results for the different players be just, right? They will of necessity be determined partly by skill and partly by luck. So you're playing a game, you roll the dice, you get a bad roll. It's not unjust. Everybody was playing the game fairly, and you just lost, He says that's maybe one way to think about the market process. And then I thought this was good because I was just reading Per Bieland criticizing Hayek. But listen to what he says. Hayek says, the function of prices is not so much to reward people for what they have done as to tell them what in their own as well as in general interest they ought to do. That means it's a forward-looking guide to the entrepreneur, right? Let's see. Sorry, feeling a little scattered at this point.
Well,
go ahead.
In all honesty, we can probably just keep going forward and add as we will. The big thing here is what Hayek's writing, and that this was written 50 years ago.
Yeah, it's amazing. One thing he talks about is the misleading use of the term distribution. So that's a term that's been used in economic theory to talk about, and really it is probably just unfortunate because it separates the idea of production from distribution. And when you really understand how the market works, those two things are just two sides of the same coin. This is Say's law, I believe. How is it that you can demand in the market? It's because you produced, right? Or maybe someone produced and gave you money, like my kids or something, right? They're able to demand because I produce and give them money. Actually, some of them are starting to make their own money. I should stop saying that. They're not 100% dependents anymore. But the unfortunate part of this is people imagine that distribution was like something that someone somewhere was doing. He says it suggests the term distribution inevitably suggests a personal distributing agent whose will or choice determines the relative position of the different persons or groups. So that made people think, oh, so the market economy is distributing more to rich white people or something. We just need to change the way the distribution works. We'll just go to the distributor and tell them to fix that, buddy.
I mean, it's on the same dashboard as the button that lets you shut down and restart the economy. You switch a dial and it goes from distribution weighted left to distribution weighted right. It's just how it works.
Right, exactly. So yeah, that's part of the problem. Let's see. He does make a very interesting point, which is quite correct. He's a little too hard on the Middle Ages, I think. But anyway, he says 1,000 years of vain efforts to discover substantively just prices or wages were abandoned. And the late schoolmen, the scholastics, recognized them to be empty formulae and taught instead that the price is determined by just conduct of the parties in the market, that is, the competitive prices arrived at without fraud, monopoly, and violence, was all that justice required. That's quite true. I've got a 2-part article on the scholastics, the Spanish scholastics. Well, they weren't just Spanish, but the late scholastics and their insights about the market. And indeed, they'd gotten to the point where they said, no, the just price is just the natural price that occurs on the market without fraud, monopoly, violence, right? Let's see. Yeah, it was only the way in which competition was carried on, not its results, that could be just or unjust. That is, you're running a race and you shoot the guy who you're racing, that is unjust, right? But if you both run the race and you follow the rules and one of you wins, we don't refer to that as a just or unjust result. That's just the result of the race, right? It's not something you categorize as just or unjust. Okay, let's see what else I wanted to pull out of this. Yeah, another one that he thought is another dangerous source of some of these problems is the idea that different services have a determined and ascertainable value to society, and that the actual remuneration frequently differs from the value. So, isn't it terrible that, well, here he gives an example. A performance of a Beethoven sonata, a painting by Leonardo, a play by Shakespeare. They are the most valuable things that our culture has produced. And how is it that they aren't worth more? Well, paintings by Leonardo are worth a lot. But anyway, why aren't people giving a fine performance of Beethoven's sonata paid more than rock stars or something like that, right? And he says, well, the problem with that is you're thinking in this collective kind of a way. Any particular service will have very different values for different members of the same society. So this is where methodological individualism that Ryan mentioned is really key. And he says we should not confuse money and resources flowing to someone in the market as a judgment of their goodness or a matter of justice or value, some kind of moral value. He says a man who supplies matches to millions and thereby earns $200,000 a year is not worth more to society than a man who supplies great wisdom or exquisite pleasure to a few thousand and thereby earns $20,000 a year. The point is, and he says, the problem with this is the point is not that the true values are different, but that the values attached to the different services by different groups of people are incommensurable. So this is an important teaching of Austrian economics. We can't really compare what the value is to me of something and the value is to Ryan of something. We can talk about how much I would pay to buy it and how much Ryan would pay to buy it or something. But even that does not tell you, let's say I'm willing to spend more on something than Ryan is. Does that mean that it is more valuable to me than Ryan in some deep sense of introspection into our souls or something? No. Maybe it just means I have more disposable income and Ryan's a poor college student. Let's imagine.
I was going to say this might also be the part where being good Austrians, we should mention that the price that something goes for on the market is not necessarily the value that you derive from something.
Right.
They are not interchangeable. The whole reason that you are buying something is because you get some sort of a profit out of it personally.
Right.
So while a very valuable piece of artwork or or what you think is a very valuable piece of artwork or a very good operatic performance or orchestral performance seems like it's going for little, there is no actual way to measure the benefit obtained by the people consuming it in the loosest sense. People viewing it, listening to it, getting something out of it. There's no way to measure that. The profit that one derives from those higher forms of art, as they're often portrayed, may be greater than something derived from the more common type of art. There's no way to tell, and that's purely down to the personal. There's a so this same sort of mind that looks at prices and determines that is the value for something not the market value or the monetary value, but the value for a good or a piece of art or something like that,
Right.
is the same exact kind of mind that will look at a graph and see if the line is going up or down, for like GDP or something like that. It's just, in this case, you may think that you're based in trad and not looking at the GDP, you're looking at the consumption of fine art or something like that. It's the same exact mistake. You have no way of telling if something is being over or undervalued on the personal level, just on the monetary level. And you can only communicate that through monetary value. It's inherently stunted in what you can do with it. There's no way for me to number exactly how much Stephen appreciated something, because there's no such numerical order of these things.
Right.
It's impossible. If it was possible,
Right.
you could you might be able to plan things slightly better than we can now, on the governmental and the personal level. It's a very strange sort of mind that would go into these things, and say that this great work of art is undervalued because its monetary price is low or whatever.
Hayek also points to the habit of people just saying, "Oh, this is just unjust that this person makes so much money," or whatever. He says it's where most people don't comprehend the usefulness of an activity, and sometimes because they actually regard it as a harmful activity. For example, the speculator. Financial markets are very difficult to understand for most people, and it's difficult to understand what value they bring. And so you'll see somebody having a lot of money from, they're just gambling on the stock exchange. Why do they have so much money? That's not fair. And he says, especially where those large earnings are used to accumulate a fortune, that you get this outcry about the injustice of it all, right? But again, it's just to misunderstand the nature of the market process. When we ask what ought to be the relative remunerations of a nurse and a butcher, of a coal miner and a judge at a high court, of the deep sea diver or the cleaner of sewers, of the organizer of a new industry and a jockey, of the inspector of taxes and the inventor of a life-saving drug, of the jet pilot or the professor of mathematics, the appeal to social justice does not give us the slightest help in deciding this. That is, it's just, and he said this in a different part. He said it's just sort of an emotional reaction. It doesn't actually help you make just legal decisions or good financial decisions, or organize society in some new amazing way, right? To some degree, you've got to just let the market process do its thing,
Well, this was the basis for most of Christendom. They didn't necessarily frame it that way, but trying to go back and explain to a what we consider to be like a good Christian prince or president or anything like that, that actually you're not a real Christian unless you regulate this specific industry in this specific way, you get laughed out of the room. Because that's not like doctrine. It's not written anywhere in scripture, nor is it easily inferred that unless you tax 15% extra on this industry, you're not a real Christian. This is why they have to go with social justice and not justice or Christian justice or any of the other real things that we have.
They have to do something new. Okay, let's see. Yeah, and he says to talk about social justice or socially unjust, it does not belong to the category of error, but to that of nonsense, like the term a moral stone, right? He says, because it's just a social order, it cannot act in a just way or an unjust way. Individuals act in a just way or an unjust way, or groups of individuals, right? But the social order is just a different sort of thing, and you can't use that to judge it. Now, I was sure I had remembered him saying something in here. Maybe it's in a footnote or something, but he had this great line. I was sure it was in Hayek. I used to quote him about the word social being like a weasel word or something that steals the meaning from the word next to it. But anyway, that's what I left with somehow. He says social justice is, he says justice clearly is a social phenomenon, and the addition of social to the noun justice, a pleonasm, such as if we spoke of social language. That is, if you really used it in the original meaning of social, just to refer to society, saying social justice in that sense is not to say any. It's just to be redundant. Just as social language, these are features of society. Justice and language are features of society. They're not features of geology or astronomy, right? They're society things. But social justice, as we hear it now, is not social in the sense of social norms. And so what we find is that people, he talks about a progression he saw in the literature of social going from the social question was posed as an appeal to the conscience of the upper classes to recognize their responsibility for the welfare of the neglected sections of society. So in other words, it was a call for like charity or something like that, right? And then social policy, sociopolitik, became the order of the day, the chief concern of all progressive and good people. And social came increasingly to displace such terms as ethical or simply good. This is a linguistic progression that often happens. C.S. Lewis wrote a whole book about it called Studies in Words, where, for example, he talks about how the word gentleman used to mean something very precise, and it eventually came to just mean like a nice guy or something, right? So similarly, social got sort of transmuted and watered down to just mean like, the social justice just means like good justice or something.
Right, and you can see that with the in American historiography, most of them will have an era of social reformers as like one of its sub-eras, basically, under the from Reconstruction to the Great Depression. Basically, they will talk about social reformers throughout that entire period. And every single one is painted in a positive light. It doesn't matter what they have to discard from their legacy or put into the memory hole. It doesn't matter what actually happened, who was working in tandem, or whatever else. Every social reformer is a hero of the American people, and if you try to speak against it in a historian's circle or something like that, that only means that you hate the poor, you hate the orphans, you hate the blacks, you hate the Indians and all these other people, you hate the poor children and wives and mothers that were beaten by alcoholics and whatever, so you can't speak against the social reformers. And that's how it was taught when I was in high school. It's how it's been taught according to the studies that I keep doing in college for whatever reason. I will not let go of American history. But that they're called social reformers, and they work for the social good every single time you come across it. It's not the Christian good or anything else. It's the social good. They are they're reforming society to put it better in line with justice, is how it's usually articulated. So what Hayek is saying here is, I don't even necessarily know that he's trying to predict this is what's happening. More that it's just already happened. This is how at least American history is taught.
He's talking about history at this point.
Right.
He's tracing how we got to the term social justice,
right.
And he's going back to social policy, the social question, until we finally land at social justice, and that really took off.
Right, but I don't even think that's necessarily history. Like, all this stuff would have been contemporary to him. If he's writing this in the 70s, this is like us writing about what's happening right now. Like, it would be like you and I saying, right now we've seen this progression from this to this to this, and here's why it's going to completely destroy any and all notions of goodness. That's what he's doing here, is in the 70s, this is when all that historiography really starts to take off. It's when they stop being progressive activists and started being social reformers. It's when they stopped being, working for some sort of religious fervor or something like that, and started working for the social good, or the collective good, or something like that. This all happens sort of at this point in time. So it's not necessarily a prediction or history. It's he is with very clear insight, basically just saying this is exactly what's happening now, and by all accounts he's correct.
Right. So in tracing it back, yeah, he is doing history here because he says it was the reference of social to the whole of society. It came into general use during the third quarter of the last century. So he's talking about the late 19th century is where he starts his tracing of this term social, uh, taking on a broader and watered down meaning. So, from such an appeal to the conscience of the public to concern themselves with the unfortunate ones and recognize them as members of the same society, the conception gradually came to mean that society ought to hold itself responsible for the particular material position of all its members and for assuring that each received what was due to him. Right. And he's saying we're not going to be able to do that with a free social order. Um, and now you've got this problem of he says it's produced a situation in which social can be used to describe almost any action as publicly desirable and has at the same time the effect of depriving any terms with which it is combined of clear meaning. This is the thing that really I walked away from this with. Not only social justice, but also social democracy, social market economy, the social state of law or social rule of law, are expressions which, though justice, democracy, the market economy, or rule of law have by themselves perfectly good meanings, the addition of the adjective social makes them capable of meaning almost anything one likes. In particular, it seems to destroy the thing they're attached to, so that the social justice is unjustice, right? The social market economy is, in fact, like socialism, basically, and so forth, right?
And this might be ever so pertinent to us, and I include this in my anti-fascist article on OGC. One of the first instances of fascist being used as an insult was actually with a prefix of social fascist, and it was what the Communist Party was calling the Social Democrats as sort of a pejorative, because they viewed them as weak-willed compromisers, so they were called social fascists. They would, according to the communists, they would lead German society into fascism just by democratic means and not into a workers' proletarian dictatorship or something like that. It's so the last century's Bolsheviks implicitly understood this. If you attach social in front of something, it can mean whatever the hell you want it to mean. So they would brand their earliest oppositions as social fascists, and somewhere along the way we just dropped the social and kept the it can mean whatever I want to mentality.
Right. Social fascists. I hadn't heard that one. And this is funny. He says there's no end to the violence that will be done to language to further some ideal. And the example of social justice has recently given rise to the expression global justice. Its negative, global injustice, was defined by an ecumenical gathering of American religious leaders as, quote, characterized by a dimension of sin in the economic, political, social, sexual, and class structures and systems of global society. So now we have global society, which can be globally just or unjust somehow. Okay. Okay, I'm going to skip social justice and equality mostly because I think we all understand about the egalitarian stuff. I'll just quote this: a government aiming to secure for its citizens equal material positions or any determined pattern of material welfare would have to treat them very unequally, right? Our whole system of morals is a system of rules of individual conduct. Okay, here's one I didn't want to skip. Equality of opportunity. Ryan, tell me if I'm being unfair, but I would say equality of opportunity is one of those things where, conservatives will be like, yeah, of course I'm against egalitarianism and all this crazy stuff, but I'm for equality of opportunity. Like, that's a safe thing to be for, right?
Right, and I'll wait until after we get past the paragraph for like the miniature rant. But yes, that is what they will default to. It is yesterday's civil rights doctrine. They're not the evil segregationists or whatever, the evil racists or the unfashionable paleocons. They're for equality of opportunity, even though no one knows what any of that stuff is now. The shoulder to fall back on has still been left. They will still default to equality of opportunity if all else fails.
Right. So given that equality of opportunity has taken on a meaning of being like a safe, anodyne, conservative position, get ready for Hayek absolutely blasting it. Yeah. Oh, and he said, yeah, I'm sorry. He's saying the same thing. He was seeing the same thing. The demand for equality of opportunity or equal starting conditions appeals to and has been supported by many who in general favor the free market order. Right? So he's like, these are our allies and friends, and they're talking about this as if it's a real thing. Um, um, and he says, and there are some things that make sense. Well, I kind of disagree with him on those things. But anyway, talking about governmental decisions. But he says, real equality of opportunity, even for persons possessing the same abilities. What would you have to do to achieve that? To achieve this, government would have to control the whole physical and human environment of all persons, and have to endeavor to provide at least equivalent chances for each. And the more government succeeded in these endeavors, the stronger would become the legitimate demand that on the same principle, any still remaining handicaps must be removed, or compensated for by putting extra burden on the still relatively favored.
The Harrison Bergeron option.
Harrison Bergeron option, exactly, by Vonnegut. This would have to go on until government literally controlled every circumstance which could affect any person's well-being. So attractive as the phrase of equality of opportunity at first sounds, once the idea is extended beyond the facilities which for other reasons have to be provided by government, it becomes a wholly illusory ideal, and any attempt concretely to realize it apt to produce a nightmare. Boy, was he right about that. He really nailed equality of opportunity here. I'm quite pleased, Ryan.
Right, and that's all just the practicality. Just as a question of principle, how do you determine when you have equality of opportunity if you can't? It's impossible. There is no set area in which you can say we have finally reached fully equal opportunity for every applicant. Because, and this is something that the conservatives, or the conservatives as they have been termed recently, yesterday's liberals thought they could reach it, and they went along with a lot of the civil rights regime's excesses. And they quickly found out that whenever they reached the part where they thought finally everything is equal, we've gotten rid of segregation practices and nepotism, at least where we need to get rid of those things, not in the government or the defense contracting industry or anything else, they finally thought that everyone would be happy and just pack up and go home. But in actuality, basically half the institutional powers pushing for equality of opportunity, the left, it's been called equality of outcome, which is what the conservatives made up as a sort of a pejorative in opposition to equality of opportunity, but they're the exact same things. They are two factions vying for some form of equal outcome. One side just thinks it should be done from the intro side, the entering side, what should happen whenever people apply. The other side thinks it should be measured by what happens in the end. So they would say there's an inequality of opportunity because the outcomes were different. They would presuppose that all people are equal in ability, and therefore any disparity in outcome would just be because we weren't equal enough in the opportunity. The people who were originally for equality of opportunity, those so-called conservatives, the liberals of yesterday, had no way to dispute this because implicitly they agreed with everything. They just did not like where it was heading. It's a very strange thing, and you can still find that today. The Jordan B. Petersons and the James Lindsays of the world will still do this trick, where they'll say all we need is equality of opportunity, none of the other equity stuff. They cannot tell you, if you ever press them on it, when to stop with the crusade for equality of opportunity. That it doesn't end. It's full egalitarianism suited into words to make it seem palatable for conservatives. So Hayek here does a really great job with the practicalities of it. There's no way to actually ensure that it is equal, but just in principle, there's no way to know when it is equal either. I would in fact argue there's no such thing as an equal opportunity because people are just inherently different. So that's the rant there.
So good.
I sincerely have been disliking James Lindsay because I've come across normal people thinking that he's like some great thinker. It's it's honestly like going back 8 years to like 2000 and the 2015, 2016, 2014 era where the right-wing thing was to be for equality of outcome, not opportunity, as if we didn't learn the lesson from that.
Right. Thanks to Andrew B in the chat, and I thought it was here, and I just found it, where Hayek talks about social as a weasel word. It's great. We're gonna hit that shortly. It's in a different book, but I was able to find it online. Okay, so that's equality of opportunity shot down. I think Ryan Hayek does a great job here. He really put his finger on something that we are now soaking in, if anything, to a greater degree than back then. And he nails equality of opportunity. Anyway, and the way that different interest groups would come along and say, "Hey, my turn," and he saw it all.
Right. And ooh, did I lose you?
Go ahead.
Okay, sorry.
No.
No, okay. So, as a university student, and I'll be very brief with this, equality of opportunity is perhaps the worst thing to happen to the educational system. There is no reason that half the people in a university right now should be there. The half the student body could be kicked out tomorrow, and the equality would improve maybe 100-fold. It's the worst thing to happen to standards and quality in the Western world, probably since, I don't know, the New Deal and the managerial takeover of all of our institutions. It's been absolutely terrible to witness the fruits of equality of opportunity, which is really just equality of outcome in sheep's clothing.
Okay, I'm excited to get to this other thing, but let's wrap up this stuff. Let's see, social justice, freedom of the law. I pretty much skipped that. My preparation wasn't as good on some of this, but let's see. There's a whole thing that Hayek gets very interested in, which is the contrast between what we can do when we're in a small group, in a tribe, and what we can do in what he unfortunately calls the Great Society, Ryan, capital G, capital S. But anyway, what he means is, I don't know. Mises talks about the same thing. The catalactic order, the extended order, is just, you have your family, your neighborhood, your church, your group, but then you're cooperating with other families, neighborhoods, churches, groups across the world in various ways, through trade, in other ways. And he just says that there's behavior that we expect when you're in your little group that we can't really try to take to the larger stage of society, of the globe, without trouble. I'm not going to try to go explain all that, but I keep thinking, Ryan, there's got to be a joke in here about how Hayek was secretly based, talking about how they're trying to get us to return to being ruled by the tribe. But anyway, I'll figure it out. Okay. Yeah, he has this thing about the worst job, the most unpleasant jobs are the worst paid, and that is one of the things that people point to. What's funny is right now we don't see anyone talking about the people with the worst jobs, because those are like rural white guys or something. They're the deplorables. They're all talking about how they can take the plum jobs and hand them out to their buddies, right?
Right, I remember when I first got into these things, that was a much more talked about thing, but it was from the right because of who was doing that. That was what the MRAs, the men's rights activists, would focus on, was who's doing the plumbing and the electrical work and all this other stuff. Well, it's the forgotten about white guys out in the countryside that have just been thrown away by society. That was the right-wing talking point a few years ago, just to show how far we've come.
Right. Okay, now this is interesting, though, and then I think we're about to wrap up this chapter, and then I wanted to share one more thing about the word social. The resentment of the loss of accustomed positions. I think this is really an important thing. Going back to the conservative, the old order reacting to the rise of industry and the merchant class, right? In England, some of the biggest and most persuasive, most effective arguments against the market were from you could say, the traditionalist right, who were finding that the wealth that they had been used to having was not there anymore, because things were changing, and so that's something he points out here. He says some people feel like they should be protected against an unmerited descent from the material position to which they have become accustomed. And there's this strong and almost universal belief that it is unjust to disappoint legitimate expectations of wealth. Okay. Now, probably most of us can't relate to this, but people who have been in a wealthy position and start to lose it because, the world changes, the market moves in a different way or whatever, they start whining about the market, and he says, the opinion that long established positions create a just expectation that they will continue serves often as a substitute for more substantial criteria of social justice. When a large group of people find their income reduced as a result of circumstances which they could not have altered or foreseen, this is commonly regarded as unjust. But he says that's the market in operation. It's only through such changes, which indicate that some activities ought to be reduced, that the efforts of all can be continually adjusted to a greater variety of facts and can be known to any one person or agency. So we could bring up, and I don't know the whole story, academic agency expert on this, but we could bring up the Welsh mines, right? They had a whole thing going with the Welsh mines. Did it end because of market forces or because of, unjust actions on various people's parts? I'm not entirely sure, but certainly one could imagine that the Welsh mines just weren't profitable anymore. And it was the market's way of saying, you Welsh guys need to get out of the mines. That's not what you should be doing, something else, and that is something that's going to happen over time. We don't all have horses to ride to our jobs. At one time, many people did, and there were a lot more jobs for people who dealt with horses. Maybe probably a lot more horses, and things changed.
Right, and that market signal has been demonized. It's the if someone says, well, we're going to have to shut down the mines, or we're going to have to get a ton of people out of the mines, or something like that, typically everyone's instinct is either, what policy can we then push to make sure that this is an easy transition, or how can we argue against the people trying to ease this transition so that we can just let the market do its thing? No one takes a step back and realizes we have improved in our material condition to the point where we don't have to have so many people, shaving years off their lives every day in the mines. They can go and do something else. It might be materially less profitable, but it's definitely not going to be as bad as, digging coal out of a mine shaft for 12 hours a day, which is why in the modern day things have gotten so nice, at least in that regard, that you can sit in an office desk and get paid probably more than half your ancestors ever did. And have much cooler things as a result of it. Obviously, that doesn't apologize for the current state of modern society, but what it does say is that every time that we have to, that we see like a mass unemployment of farmers, or miners, or oil well drillers, or something like that, it's not the worst thing in the world. It's not society's collapsing or this apocalypse is coming to the blue collar industry. What's happening is material conditions have improved to the point where these people no longer need to devote themselves to digging or farming or mining. It should be seen as one of the few times that you can invoke actual progress, because we can measure things have improved to where we are better now than you were beforehand, at least in this regard.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, he says you end up with just the protection of entrenched interests under the name of social justice. And he says social justice becomes a little more than a pretext for making the interest of the particular groups prevail over the general interest of all. And then in his conclusion of this chapter, if political discussion is to become honest, it is necessary that people should recognize that the term social justice is intellectually disreputable, the mark of demagogy or cheap journalism, which responsible thinkers ought to be ashamed to use because once its vacuity is recognized, its use is dishonest. We should make the speakers and writers thoroughly ashamed ever again to employ the term social justice. Now, as I said, I don't think the term social justice itself is used as much. We have to identify all the other terms that are used that are basically children of social justice, like equity, probably a lot of the use of the term rights at this point is basically just social justice speak, and again, and make it intellectually disreputable if we can possibly do that. Let's see. Okay, this is all good stuff, but I don't think we need to cover this. And he says often how the gospel of social justice aims at sordid sentiments, the dislike of people who are better off than oneself, or simply envy. Okay. All right. So thanks to Andrew B. I have found something that I have been wanting to find. I thought I'd find it in this chapter. That's what got me confused, and I didn't find it. Oops, not slides. Give me just a sec. I have something else to share. I'm so excited. Look at this. Okay, where's my copy? Okay, right. So I'll go back to his list of words, which is awesome. But wait for this first. Okay, this is the passage that really stuck out to me. Social justice has become the word social has become the most harmful instance of what, after Shakespeare's I can suck melancholy out of a song as a weasel suck eggs, some Americans call a weasel word. As a weasel is alleged to be able to empty an egg without leaving a visible sign, so can these words deprive of content any term to which they are prefixed, while seemingly leaving them untouched. A weasel word is used to draw the teeth from a concept one is obliged to employ, but from which one wishes to eliminate all implications that challenge one's ideological premises. I thought this was so great, the notion of the weasel, social as a weasel word. Okay, this is where it gets fun. So he had been, this is from, Fatal Conceit, which is his last book that was published posthumously. And so he made a list of words that get qualified by the adjective social, a list of words, over 160 nouns. And I'm going to just skip around. But as you listen to these words combined with the word social, hear the weasel happening. Hear it sucking the meaning out of it, right? Social contract. Not a contract that anyone signed, right? It's a social contract.
Literally not a contract.
Not a contract. Yes, exactly. Let's see. Trying to pick out some others. Social market economy. He calls that one out in particular because of East Germany using that term. We have a market economy, a social market economy, right? Oh, wait. Oh, I just realized how the alphabetization is working. It's left to right. Okay, I was going down the column. That's okay. Social compact, very similar to social contract, right? Social conscience, that's a good one. It didn't bother my... yeah, anyway, go ahead, Ryan. Social conscience.
Yeah, I was about to say, once again, another being which can possess no conscience. Like,
right.
You cannot show me, you cannot describe to me the social conscience or any of its parts or what it's thinking, because it doesn't exist.
Social ethics. Oh, this is interesting. Social fascism.
Right,
He puts fascism in the list. Okay. Right. There we go. Social good. That's a good one for social evil and social good. That's a good one for him to call out. Like, what does that mean exactly? And how is it different from just, why don't you just say good or evil, right? Let's see. Sorry. didn't find this ahead of time. Social justice, of course, or I would have already highlighted some of these words. Social morality, social organism. That's really on the nose in a way, right, Ryan? Because that's trying to directly turn society into what it isn't, right?
Right. And it's they have a very much of a biologist view towards it whenever they call it a social organism. At least they're being upfront, because they will start to tinker with parts of society as we actually understand it, and trying to engineer people into going one way or another, having this response or this reaction. It's very deceitful.
Oops, sorry, I just realized that what's on the screen is not what I wanted to be on the screen. Oh, oops. I was going through that list. I didn't realize how this worked. It integrates quite nicely with the PDF thing. Okay. Oops, sorry. Okay, yeah. Let's see. Social policy, social ownership, right?
Another one in which it's literally not ownership, right?
That's not ownership. Social problem. Let's see. Social reform. Social revolution. Social science. Well, anyway, it's a whole separate conversation there. Social tenets. Society doesn't have tenets. Social thought. Social utility, social value. We discussed that a bit. Social virtue. Many of these cases are, as we said, take a word that has a very obvious and well understood and old and traditional meaning when it's applied to human action, right? A human can sign a contract, right? Can make a contract. A human can value something, want something, will something. A society doesn't will things. A society doesn't want things. A society doesn't sign a contract. And a society is not just or unjust. And that's what we needed to say, I think. Right, Ryan?
Yes, I'm very happy with how this turned out.
Good. Yeah, I think it's a really insightful. I mean, he was ahead of the game. And man, I wish everyone had listened to him back then, because now we're just suffering.
And if you want to see this synthesized with other good works and minds, remember, Stephen is going to be speaking on the topic of justice, as you elaborated at the beginning of the stream.
Yes, at the
national event.
In a week. 1 week. I'm not ready. Anyway, but this stream helped me, because one of the things I wanted to make sure is to get everything out of this, out of Hayek here for part of my talk. Okay, couple things. We have a super sticker from Hello. If it's a super sticker, where's the sticker? Oh, I see. It doesn't show the sticker through StreamYards. It was a smiley face with sunglasses on it. You can see it if you scroll up in the live chat. Okay, what else here? We have Mutant number 12 says the true unjust are the subversive Norwoodists seething about the locks of liberty flowing constantly during stream. This defeats Zoomer fade fallacies. You'll have to translate that to me one of these days, Ryan.
Well, the last sentence is poking fun at the Zoomer fade and perm, I believe, where they shave this part and have it up at the top.
Got it. Zoomer fade fallacies. Very good. Thank you, Mutant number 12. That's funny. And then Lady of Shalott notes that The Road to Serfdom by Hayek was a hugely influential text on British conservative Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in her 3 terms of office from 1979 to 1990. Yes, that is absolutely true. I remember giving a speech where I mentioned how Thatcher threw Hayek's book and says, "This is our Bible," or something like that, threw it on the table,
Right, it was The Road to Serfdom, and what was the other one? It was like the Constitution of Liberty or something
Constitution
like that.
of Liberty, yeah. I think. Yeah. Okay, so those are the super chats. Let me just double check Subscribe Star, because sometimes our subscribers slips a tip through there. Yes, Sam153 says, have a great time at the event with a nice donation. Thank you so much. And I think that's everything. We'll see you in 2 weeks from today with Black Horse on this show. Or I know that I'm going to see some of you. Some have mentioned it on Twitter and so forth. Some of you Ryan and I and my wife will get to meet you at the event, or meet you again if we saw you last year at the event in the Nashville area. Ryan, anything else you want to talk about?
I don't know if you have anything else after this, but
I do.
7:00 p.m. Central Time, 8:00 Eastern, the Old Glory Club is going to be going live talking about the recently deceased environmental activist, male voting advocate, austere environmental scholar, Ted Kaczynski. They're going to be discussing him and his social message, if you want to call it that, quite ironically after this. His political message might be more apt. And talk about what he got right, maybe if he got something wrong, I'm sure they would talk about that. Probably parts of his actual life. Probably, I would be shocked if there was not a biographical, because we have we have Pete Q on there. Pete Quinonez is going to be speaking on him with I forget who our other streamer is going to be. Paul Fahrenheit. So it has to be a good stream. We have our great firebrand and our great scholar on this subject to talk about it tonight. That's 7:00 p.m. Central, 8:00 Eastern. Ted Kaczynski at the Old Glory Club YouTube channel. Do not miss it. It is bound to be good.
And right before that, we got a full-packed evening for you here, or whatever time it is for you. 1 hour from now, I will be on with Red Hawk to talk about Father's Day for a Father's Day stream. And then, as Ryan just said, 2 hours from now, we'll have the Old Glory Club stream on Ted Kaczynski, who I had not really given any good read to, Ryan. And then I listened to Skeptical Waves' narration of Hit Where It Hurts, I believe is what it's called. And actually, it really helped me for my talk next week. So I'm really glad I read that.
Right, and if you in the next few hours want to do a little bit of brushing up, our good OGC member Charlemagne put out an article for the Old Glory Club called Hit Where It Hurts, with a subtitle being "And the System's Perfected Trick." Basically, he's given a rundown of some of the thoughts of Ted Kaczynski as it pertains to us now that he's passed, and so that would be one good place to look. As you mentioned, Skeptical Waves would be another. I mean, this might be heresy at this point, but personally, there were other people saying the same things that Ted K was saying. It's just they weren't nearly as flashy in their delivery, perhaps. But this will be interesting, even though I don't necessarily see the specific value attached to him. All of these Ted K streams that are done in our sphere always are inevitably good and useful. Go and check that out. At the very least, just to see our brilliant minds of the Old Glory Club discussing very pertinent subjects to our modern day.
Yep. All right. I did put a link to Charlemagne's article for the Old Glory Club on Ted K. And it's really, I mean, probably true of a lot of the stuff our friends are going to do, Ryan, right? It's more of talking about other things, using some of the points of Ted K as a lens, right?
Well, yeah, you can't just read them out word for word and pass it off as your own analysis. I mean, we do add value to these things when we talk about them, believe it or not.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks, Ryan. And thanks to all of you. See you in 2 weeks. And talk to you later. Bye.